Good evening, everyone. I'm hoping that you can all hear and see me right now. Um, when I agreed to do this, I was told that Bev Jackson had managed to figure out how to do this, and so I thought if Bev can do it, then I can surely get the knack of it as well. So it's very good to be here with all of you tonight, and I've been sat watching the same interview that you've all just been watching as well. And we'll get on to that in just a moment. And I'm looking forward to hearing what your thoughts and comments and reflections are based on what you've seen. Just a reminder that it is possible, I'm told, to donate to LGB Alliance as part of this. I'm told that there should be a dollar sign at the bottom of your screen, and all donations are very much welcome. So obviously I was there interviewing Ritchie in the moment. And yet, sat here tonight in front of my computer screen, re-watching it back, it is no less moving or hard-hitting. And I'm struck by a few things. Once again, I'm struck by Ritchie, and I meant every word that I said to him at the very end of that interview, which is that the way in which he carries himself and the way in which he speaks about this, particularly given what he's been through, is astounding. And I think more people need to hear from Ritchie, actually. And it's great that you're all here with me tonight, having this conversation. But as far as I'm concerned, the rest of this country needs to hear stories from Ritchie and others who have gone through this. Because I think most of the population just put their head in the sand, basically. They'd rather not get involved in this. They think it's far too controversial. And the truth of the matter is that there are children and young adults who are effectively being mutilated and castrated. I mean, this is a national crisis as far as I'm concerned. And I feel such a sense of anger for the fact that this has happened. And I feel a sense of anger as well, particularly towards the medical profession and my own mental health profession as well, who I think have let these children, these young adults down so badly. I've lost a hell of a lot of faith in the therapeutic community since all of this has begun. I have a few other reflections as well based on watching this, but just to say, please do send through any comments, any questions, and we'll try and get through as many of those as possible. There's no set time for this. We'll just kind of keep it going for as long as we can, really. So I'm just having a look through some of the comments so far. And somebody said, what's the advice around therapists trying to hold the line? Look, cancel culture still exists. I mean, I'm just one example of that, and we all know others who have fallen victim to this as well. And that more people are going to be cancelled, unfortunately, on this issue, because it's still, unfortunately, seen as so controversial and so against political correctness. So I envisage more people losing their jobs, their reputations, and their livelihoods. But by the flip side of this, unless we start to create a wave of people in a variety of disciplines standing up in the workplace and saying, actually, I believe that sex is binary and immutable, and I believe that this medicalization of children is abhorrent. Until we get that wave, I can't see things changing that much, particularly with the way that the political climate is at the moment, because what we've seen from the other side is that they're very good at mobilizing. They're very good at making their voices and opinions heard. And the truth of the matter is that I think we do have a silent majority on our side, because it's the side of science and biology and reality. But people are too afraid to speak up about it. But there'll come a point at which they can't cancel anyone else. And I hope within the mental health profession, while my case is ongoing at least, the therapeutic bodies will think twice before simply excommunicating someone else. But at the same time, people have to reflect on what their own personal circumstances are. And I don't recommend that someone puts their head above the parapet if there's a real risk that they're going to be made unemployed and unable to provide for their their children and their families. It's a very, very fine balance. It has to be a personal decision at the end of the day. Trying to see what other comments there are. Just a few other reflections that I had. Ritchie in the video said that people can be made to feel like gods or goddesses when they're coming out as trans, when they're transitioning, particularly in these online communities. And I think this gets to the heart of this contagion point, really, because there's so many children out there, particularly these days, when we know how busy and hectic people's lives are, how engrossed people are in their phones, and I think how lost many young people are feeling, not really knowing what their direction is in life. And so there's some children out there who won't have been celebrated in their lives so far, won't have been given positive affirmation about who they are. And here presents an opportunity, because for a young person, they can identify as trans, they can come up with their pronouns, they can start to transition, and all of a sudden they are being celebrated. I mean, mermaids very literally tell their supporters to celebrate people who are trans. It's not simply to respect or to empathize or to accept, it's celebrate. And I can imagine how appealing that must be for a young person who hasn't been celebrated for anything else in their life. And you've got these online communities telling people that they're beautiful. And again, I mean, what young person, particularly going through puberty and all the insecurities that brings with it, what young person doesn't want to be told that? You know, I keep seeing these kind of memes and these cartoons doing the rounds on Twitter being shared by trans activists. And there's one of it's a young girl, and she's in front of her computer screen binding her breasts, and she's speaking to a stranger on a chat room, and the stranger saying, "You're looking great." You know, what young person doesn't want to hear this? But it shows the way in which this kind of grooming, cult-like behavior is being propagated, really. Please do fire through any of the questions. I've seen a question here. What would heal the therapy profession from this decline? I'm really concerned about the existing therapeutic bodies. They seem to have been ideologically captured by this. They're all signatories to this. For those of you who don't know, there's a document called the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy. It's basically a precursor to formal conversion therapy legislation. And it appears, I mean, it's very vague and ambiguous in language, but it appears to kind of push an affirmative approach to gender identity. So on one level, how is it possible to work within the existing therapeutic bodies if what they're pushing and what they're teaching is gender ideology? And I'm beginning to think more and more that there's going to need to be some sort of breakaway group, actually, of therapists who start up on their own and start a new accreditation body. And I think it's doable because therapy is not a regulated profession in this country. So I do think it's doable, but it's very difficult because these groups have been around for a long time. They carry a lot of clout, unfortunately, and they have a lot of backing and a lot of funding. But I'm more and more losing faith that we can change this from the inside, unfortunately. I was also reflecting when Ritchie was speaking about all of the horrible side effects, if we call it like that, of his surgery that he continues to live with every day. And I was thinking about the fact that so much of this language it's so false. These words are misnomers. You know, we've got the word trans, transition, but as we know, it's not physically, scientifically, biologically possible to actually transition to the other sex. And yet we call it transition. And I was thinking about the word detransition. And the same applies. Is it ever truly possible to detransition? And the answer has to be surely no. Because Ritchie, if we consider him, you know, he's a detransitioner. He doesn't identify as trans anymore. He's living his life as the man that he is, and yet he's suffered irreversible changes to his body that can never change, and he's lost parts of himself that he can never get back. And with all the will in the world, and he can think, I want to detransition as much as possible, but it's not physically possible to do so. I think we need to change the language in this space, really, because we're setting up children for a bit of a fool here. We're making them believe that things are possible when they simply are not. And I think we need to reflect on the fact and continue to emphasize to young people out there that these decisions they're making, whether it's puberty blockers or hormones or sex reassignment surgery, this is irreversible, and they could live with regret for the rest of their lives. I'm also interested in people's thoughts around, and I saw some conversation happening whilst the video was showing earlier around adults versus children, because obviously we spend so much of our time talking about protecting children and safeguarding children. And yet we've got Ritchie and others who came into this in slightly later life when they were adults in legal and technical terms, and yet they fell victim and prey to all of this much in the same way. So I do wonder what the best way to address this is, because clearly adults also need support, and adults can also get caught up in this. Again, gender dysphoria, it's a mental health condition. It can affect anyone. It can affect children. It can affect adults. So what do we do about adults? Because I've not gone so far as to say yet that I believe that medical transitioning should be outlawed and criminalized completely. I haven't said that yet, because sometimes I'm of the view that adults, if they're informed and if they have the capacity to make decisions, that maybe they should be entitled to make decisions that they want, even if they later regret it. I mean, I'm interested in people's thoughts on this. But for children, certainly not. And I said in the interview with Ritchie that there's children who can't buy a bloody scratch card but can consent to this treatment. It's really quite worrying. But what do we do about adults? I'm interested in people's thoughts. I see that Malcolm has put, should medical transition be funded by the NHS? I mean, clearly not, on the basis that this is a mental health condition. I find that this is the strongest argument of all, actually, and if you keep coming back to this, you can't really go too wrong with it. Mental health conditions should not be treated with irreversible hormones and surgery. And as myself and Ritchie spoke about in the interview, gender dysphoria is the only mental health condition out there in which we do this. If somebody comes to their therapist and says, I feel that I'm terribly ugly, I hate my body, I think I'm obese, the therapist is not going to go, well, if you feel that way, then I agree with you. Yes, in fact, you are terribly ugly and horribly obese, and maybe you should consider some liposuction. It doesn't happen. And yet we've got people who can present to a therapist and say, I hate my body, my genitals, I don't feel like I belong in it, I want to have bits of my body removed. And the therapist will say, well, if that's how you feel, then yes, that's exactly what you should do. I mean, it's just fundamentally inconsistent. It flies in the face of everything that the medical and therapeutic professions should stand for. On the funding point, I'm as much concerned about private clinics like Gender GP, although there's many others. I'm as much concerned about them as I am concerned about the NHS, because there's no oversight and transparency. And you do some Googling and you see these clinics popping up all over this country, and they're glorifying their surgeries. And they've got testimonials, from all their happy customers. Sometimes I've even come across some websites of clinics which has got kind of young girls posing with their surgeon post-surgery with their scars on show, kind of smiling and giving thumbs up. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. But there's a massive private market out there for this, and I happened to be looking through my own health insurance policy the other day, because I was looking to go and see a podiatrist. I won't go into too much detail about that. I was looking to go and see a podiatrist, and I saw that podiatry wasn't covered by the health insurance scheme. Okay. I was just flicking through my policy to see what was covered in general. And I saw that in my policy, full sex reassignment surgery is covered. And I find that astonishing, actually. But there's a lot of money to be made in this. It's a very, very lucrative game indeed. And I'm happy to see that the NHS have put in these new proposed guidelines, which some of you may have seen. Maybe we can put a link out to that later. But it's, you know, basically suggesting that they're going to ban the use of puberty blockers except for formal research studies. I mean, that's a huge, huge shift. But again, what do we do about these private clinics? And particularly in light of these World Professional Association of Transgender Health WPATH guidelines, which some of you may have seen, which have recommended removing all age limits, including for surgery, you know, suggesting that children as young as 9 years old can receive mastectomies or phalloplasties. It's terrifying. And these guidelines are used internationally. The Scottish government have relied on them. The NHS have relied on them in the past. America under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are also relying on them in terms of some of the seismic shifts of policy they're bringing in relation to transgender healthcare. So yeah, I'm as concerned about the private clinics as I am with the NHS. Just having another look through the comments. I mean, yeah, someone's mentioning about kind of public health and identifying and demonstrating the harm that can be caused from this in the same way that we do for obesity, smoking, drugs, and drinking. I mean, that would be great, you know, if we could actually have some proper publicity and advertising campaigns about the risks of undergoing this treatment. I mean, I can't see it coming anytime soon, particularly the way we are politically and the media in this country as well. But it's not dissimilar, is it, at the end of the day? And there's lots of things, you know, thinking back to our own childhood, there were lots of things that we did that were experimental or rebellious, partly to just push back against society and societal norms, as all adolescents do, but also partly to try and find ourselves, you know, to try and discover who we are and where we fit in. So that, you know, on that level, I think all of us here can understand and appreciate that. Actually, I can understand where these children are coming from in terms of reaching out and trying to grasp something that makes them feel like they belong, makes them feel better about themselves. But as we've said already, it's a complete false economy. And the difference is now that children experimenting, it is irreversible. You know, I remember I've watched Dr. Az Hakim talk about this before in his kind of goth days. You know, children who are growing up and entering into kind of goth or emo culture, you know, they can take off that makeup, they can change the clothes or the hairstyle. But these children who have started on these hormones, they cannot undo what has been done to them. Will the government proceed with the conversion therapy bill? It's still up in the air. And the last that we heard from it was that the government were going to proceed with it on the basis of sexual orientation, but not on gender identity, which I think is an appropriate position for them to take. It's worth saying that conversion therapy is a bit of a misnomer anyway. You know, most of these types of incident take place in family or therapeutic family or religious settings. There aren't therapists up and down this country practicing what is known as conversion therapy, and most actions associated with conversion therapy have already been criminalised. So when you hear mermaids and Stonewall saying if the government don't ban conversion therapy, they're enabling the torture of young people, well, torture is already a criminal offence in this country. And it's worth sometimes just reminding those individuals of that. But in terms of what the government are going to do, I have no idea. You know, Boris, for all his sins, was at least saying the right things. You know, I still remember when he came out and said, there is a difference between men and women. I mean, the fact that he even had to say that in the first place says a lot about the society we're living in, but at least he said it. And I had high hopes for Truss as well. I don't particularly know where Ritchie stands on any of this, to be honest. He seems to be keeping his cards quite close to his chest. But the way that things are going in the NHS and the closure of the Tavistock, I do have some hope. But we just never know. And then, of course, there's the risk of a Labour government. And myself and Ritchie spoke about that in the interview. We spoke about Sir Keir Starmer appearing at Pink News for their annual award ceremony. And the fact that he's proposing potentially criminalising misgendering, and he's outright said he wants to ban all forms of conversion therapy, including for gender identity. So, I mean, there's a lot of faults of the Conservative government, but, you know, dear, if we find ourselves with a Labour government in the not too distant future, I dread to think what's going to happen. And actually, I fear that it could set us back significantly. We've made so much progress on this front and done so much awareness raising over the last 18 months, 2 years. I'm worried it could all go backwards again. So politically, as far as I'm concerned, it has to be the Conservative Party over the others, as things currently stand. Yeah, I agree with that last comment about Labour's messaging, and I still don't know why people do this. Why people go along with this ideology? Again, I'm interested in thoughts and views from those of you watching. I think some people must genuinely believe this. They must genuinely think that actually they're doing a good service and they're just helping people to be themselves and try and create a fairer and more equal society. I mean, we know in reality that isn't quite how this operates, but maybe some people believe in that. And I think for others, they're just not informed enough, or they don't take the time to become informed. I think for some, they're just too scared to speak out for fear of the ramifications and the abuse that might come their way, because there's still a lot of abuse. I mean, you know, reflecting back to the LGB Alliance conference, and I wrote something on this on Twitter afterwards, but within the building, felt like there was a lot of compassion, a lot of empathy, a lot of support. And then I looked out the window and I saw, you know, people there with placards, chanting, swearing, abuse. It's that says how divided we are as a society. So I do understand people's concerns in that space. But I think for many, particularly for some of the corporations out there, that it's all for profit. You know, and I see each day a new company coming out saying that they're going to start having pronoun badges. They're no longer going to use the words ladies and gentlemen. They're going to start introducing gender neutral toilets. You know, these companies don't care about anything except profit and virtue signaling. And they'll signal whatever it takes to get that profit. So I think companies have a hell of a lot to answer for. And I think, you know, we've put our focus on charities and the media and the government, but I think some of these private corporations need to have the spotlight shone on them as well, actually, because they're enabling all of this. I remember I went to a talk that was organised by a group of gender ideologues, kind of trans activists. This wasn't so long ago. So, you know, we had some of the legal victories we'd had. And one of them was asked whether he was worried about the future for trans people. And he said that he wasn't. He said that he had a lot of confidence in the future because even though politicians and the media were beginning to turn against their ideology and their beliefs, he said companies are not. And he said companies are far more influential than the media and the politicians. And so as long as the companies are out there pushing the narrative, supporting pronouns, then it's going to be all right. And I think that individual may be correct there, actually. And we know from the young people in our society, they give a lot more weight to what is said by their favorite brands and online TikTokers and Instagram influencers than they do to their MP or their local council members. So I do worry about the corporate field. Somebody said, ladies and gentlemen, is a very British politeness that will never go away. I certainly hope so. Although, to be honest, I was obviously rewatching the interview with Ritchie, and someone that I know messaged me during it, because when I was doing the Q&A at the end of that interview, I said something like, oh, we'll go now to this gentleman in the middle, or we'll go to that lady on the side. And this message from someone who's very close to me said, but James, you can't really say that these days, can you? Is that it's not really politically correct, is it? Because how do you know how they identify? How do you know that they're actually a man or a woman? So people are genuinely believing this, actually. It's become a matter of political correctness now, simply to say, man, woman, ladies, gentlemen. It's terrifying, really, and even more depressing. And maybe I'm a bit late to this party. Maybe some of you have already seen this, but my sister tonight linked to me a TikTok video with a couple talking about raising a baby, THEYBY, a baby, which is a gender-neutral baby. Words cannot describe. I'm interested in people's thoughts around how we raise the platform of Ritchie and other detransitioners, because, as I say, people need to hear this. It's all well and good myself and others reeling off statistics and talking about research papers and all the rest of it, but I don't think the public mood is going to shift in a visible way until they're actually hearing firsthand the trauma that these young people have been through. How do we get the message out there? Someone said a documentary, a movie. I agree. The problem is getting it out into the mainstream media. I was actually part of a recent documentary which was looking at the Tavistock and the impact of detransitioners, and in fact, Ritchie and others featured in this. A number of detransitions featured in this, and none of the mainstream media would take it. And I've seen the emails, and it was pitched to the BBC, and it was pitched to Netflix, and it was pitched to Channel 4, and none of them would take it. Possibly because they're concerned about the backlash. I don't know. But when I go onto these channels and I see programs like Naked Attraction or various forms of RuPaul's Drag Race being broadcast, and I look at that and I think, and yet you won't show a documentary of one of the biggest medical scandals of our time. I mean, it's a disgrace. Someone has asked, have I experienced personal fallout from friends? Have I managed to pique anyone? I'm very lucky, actually, in the sense that all of my main relationships have remained intact off the back of this. I know that's not the same for everyone else. That doesn't mean that those around me necessarily understand this. Some of my family members are of a bit of an older generation will kind of say to me from time to time, they'll say, are you still doing that trans thing? And I don't think they really know what that thing is, but at least they're showing some interest. But for some, I know people who've lost family and friends over this. And when we saw what Brexit was like in this country, people literally splitting up, getting divorced and losing friends over whether they voted to leave or to remain. I mean, this is 10 times worse, because this really is seen as a moral issue. And, if you're painted as a bigot or a transphobe, I mean, these words stick. And I see this flying about on social media so often. And I see abuse directed towards Ritchie. I mean, look, it's one thing to throw abuse at me, but even over recent days, I've seen abuse being thrown at Ritchie, including by a number of trans people. And I just think, where is the compassion? Because Ritchie was in their shoes once. Can they not empathise at all? But I worry that so many people these days are so self-engrossed and even narcissistic in certain ways that they simply can't understand the plight of others. But, seeing Ritchie get stick for speaking out simply about his experience and the way in which he's been harmed and damaged by this, I think I simply cannot allow that. It should not be happening. Yeah, some people are talking about how to engage with those on the other side of the argument. I don't know. I want more debate. I think we need more debate at the end of the day. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and also that idea that the more that we discuss things with someone else with a different view, the more likely one of us is correct. That's how human beings learn, develop, and grow. Actually, through debate, it's through challenge, particularly in the context of things like mental health and science. But we can't seem to get these debates. And I'm often getting invited onto platforms in which everyone on the panel and in the audience are of the same view as me, but I'm very rarely being given an opportunity to have debates against people of a differing view. I mean, those of you who follow me on Twitter will know that I have spent far too long trying to get individuals such as Katie Montgomery to agree to a debate with me, because they're very vocal when they're in their silo. But as soon as you offer up a debate on a neutral territory in a public platform, they become the equivalent of wallflowers. And we've seen this similarly with Susie Green from Mermaids, and we've seen it too with Nancy Kelly from Stonewall. These people just refuse to debate. So if anyone has any ideas for that, I certainly welcome it, because I think we need that to happen. And actually, we need the public to see the arguments put to one another. Because I genuinely believe that we've got the arguments on our side. And that's one of the reasons, and I feel very strongly about this, I think it's one of the reasons we don't need to resort to the petty tactics of the other side when it comes to abuse and throwing slurs and vitriol, because it doesn't really help our cause. And I think when they do it, it shows them up for what they are, and it undermines the arguments that they try to make. But we don't need that, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with reality. And science, and I think we should always fall back on that rather than resorting to that. Although I know it's tempting at times to get into one of these scuffles on Twitter. I try and avoid it myself, because I just don't see the use in it. Will Katie Montgomery ever debate me? I have absolutely no idea. Katie wrote a written argument, and asked me to respond in writing to her, which I did. I responded the same day, and I think that was about 6 to 9 months ago, and I still haven't had a response. So God knows what Katie's doing. But no, I doubt that I'm actually going to ever get face to face with Katie Montgomery. And look, it's. I was looking at the numbers, watching the interview with myself and Ritchie, and we're in the hundreds at one point, which is good, but it's just not enough, really, is it? The work that LGB Alliance is doing is fantastic, and obviously under a huge amount of pressure, given everything else they're going through at the moment, as we all know. But we need to find a way to get this out there, particularly in relation to what Ritchie and others are speaking about. I'm also interested in people's thoughts about how gender ideology links to other ideologies that are going on, because we know that there's this kind of woke subjectivism, kind of postmodernistic way of looking at the world, particularly amongst the younger generation. And we know that critical race theory is being pushed hard and fast in schools and educational establishments as well. These things to me all seem to be interlinked in one way or another. We talk a lot about symptoms and causes, but is gender identity ideology just a symptom of wider unease in society? Myself and Ritchie were saying gender dysphoria is a symptom of wider unease in an individual. Is gender ideology a symptom of wider unease in society? Why are people resorting to these ideologies? Yes, someone's mentioned Andrew Doyle's book, New Puritans, which is on my to-read list, but I've heard that it's extremely good. I think we need to think about how to tackle these things all together, actually. They're all one and the same in many ways. someone's mentioned about being a victim. Look, victim politics is certainly popular these days, and we see hierarchies of victimhood emerging as well. And that does two things. It robs people of their resilience, and I think that cannot be a good thing. It also means that people are less likely to be able to understand the plight of others. It's very much, you against me against the world. And if you're not with us, you're against us. And I think that might be why many of these trans activists can't seem to appreciate at least some compassion or empathy for Ritchie and others who have gone through this. Because as far as they're concerned, it's all a game of victimhood, really. I agree with the individual who's just said that Ritchie, Sinead, and other detransitioners should have a meeting in Parliament. I mean, I think that would be fantastic. Their voices just aren't being heard. We need our politicians to start listening to this, because God knows they spent enough time listening to Mermaids and Stonewall. And I still remember not so long ago seeing all those various MPs posting photographs of them posing with Stonewall placards, kind of mindlessly, because it's the cool thing to do, and because Stonewall was so fashionable. I'd like to see some of them starting to meet with the people whose lives have been ruined by this ideology. Someone's mentioned about this rejection of reality and words. I mean, language is so important. So important. And I don't think we push back on it enough, actually. I think that I certainly feel this way sometimes. I don't know about you, but we're fighting enough fires, and when we're dealing with, medical transitioning, that we need to focus on that. But the softer stuff like pronouns, etc., is just as concerning. And it's the way in which this ideology has managed to kind of infiltrate its way into society, and we've allowed it to happen. When you're seeing companies now encouraging people to put their pronouns in their email signature, and people going along with this without even raising a challenge or an objection. People misrepresenting the law. I saw when I was traveling on the tube the other night that there was a poster up talking about hate crime, and it was listing out the protected characteristics that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, will not tolerate hate crime against. And what did it say? It said gender identity. And we know that is not the wording of the Equality Act. It is I would argue, willful misrepresentation of the Equality Act. Some people even, I've seen schools in their equality policies just use the word gender as a protected characteristic. It isn't. It's gender reassignment. It's a very different thing. So we need to tackle this, the way in which language is been taken over by this. Because if you have young people growing up and being surrounded by these pronouns and all of these, never-ending identities, and being told that, you can identify as whatever you like, and, the doctor simply guessed what sex you were when you were born. What type of message does that send to a child? It sends the message that, well, maybe the doctor made a mistake when I was born, and every single one of us must have our own unique, innate sense of gender identity that is fluid and can change, moment to moment. And it's already setting a child down that pathway of disassociating with themselves and the body that they've been given. So I push back on the language as much as possible. And then there's the point about stereotypes as well, which myself and Ritchie spoke about. Because it's so bizarre in a society that claims to be liberal, we really have regressed. It's crazy. When I see these children's colouring books, which are suggesting that girls who like the colour blue might be trapped in the wrong body. That isn't an exaggeration. That's very literally what these books are suggesting. I mean, it's crazy that we've allowed this to happen in such a liberal society, playing up to these old regressive stereotypes. Where does that get us? The point is, and the message that we should be sending to children is that your sex is your sex. And it doesn't matter what attributes are typically associated with femininity or masculinity that you exhibit. It doesn't change anything, and it doesn't make you any less of a boy or any more of a girl. At the end of the day, you're perfectly entitled to have what hobbies and interests you want and pursue what vocation you want and dress how you want, and you don't need to change your sex to do that. You don't need to take puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and have surgery to do that. At the end of the day, live the life that you want to live. That seems to me to be the kind of more liberal message that we should be delivering. And yes, it's not being delivered. We're being told, actually, if you don't like yourself, you should just change it. And I think what type of message is that to send to a young person? Just going back through the comments again. Menno said there's more to a person than just self-perception. Well, I completely agree with that, actually. We've become fixated on self-identity. And again, this comes into this idea of narcissism and self-absorption, actually. Because as human beings, we don't exist in silos. We're a relational species. We exist in relation to others. And the way in which we're seen by others, is important. And actually, having other human beings around us to regulate us is one of the reasons that society is able to survive and not descend into complete and utter chaos and anarchy. There's lots of ways, and we see this with children as well. Children only learn how to present in the world and how to grow up to be, sensible, well-engaged members of society by the feedback that they receive consciously or subconsciously from others around them. So other people's views are very important when it comes to that. And this obsession with self-identity basically does away with that. It basically sends the message to people. And, we hear people saying this, you haven't had my lived experience, and so you don't know what I'm talking about. I mean, that flies in the face of the concept of empathy, which we know that we can exhibit as human beings. We're able to put ourselves into the shoes of other people. But to say to somebody, you haven't had my lived experience, and therefore I don't give a damn what you think or what you say, it's that kind of shutting off from society. It's sticking a middle finger up to basically everyone else in society and saying, I'm going to live exactly how I want to live and I don't care what you think, and not having those kind of gentle boundaries that we should have as a society and not being receptive to the feedback from other people around us. I think it's really dangerous, and I think it can descend, as I said, into chaos. Self-branding, yeah. But again, we're living in the TikTok and Instagram generation. It's all about one's personal brand and image. It's unsurprising when we tell people that you should celebrate being trans. And we think about the word celebrate, it's very little wonder that we've got young people out there trying to become almost celebrities off the back of this. And I see it. I come across so much. I mean, thankfully, I don't actually have TikTok, but I'm forever being sent stuff from this. And for these children, being trans is their identity. It is what makes them unique, special, and interesting. It's basically all that they seem to be able to offer. And I think that's really quite concerning. I still remember a great article by Douglas Murray from a few years ago. I think it was during Pride Month. And he was talking about the LGBT culture generally. And I think he finished off by saying something like, okay, you're trans, that's great. Now tell me something interesting about yourself. And that's the point, isn't it? At the end of the day, these ideologies, these identities, and these kind of immutable characteristics were so much more than that. Just because one knows that, I'm a straight white male, it doesn't say anything about my experiences in life, and it doesn't say anything about the content of my character or the thought inside my head or the emotions that I feel. You know, we can descend into stereotypes and generalizations all that we want, but how helpful really is that? And should we not be trying to view people as individuals rather than get wrapped up with these never-ending labels? I don't know what people's thoughts are on that, but it's just, it's not something that I acknowledge, really, at the end of the day. And I get this abuse on Twitter. You know, I keep being told I'm a straight white male. A straight white cis male is the new edition. As if I don't have an opinion. It's really quite worrying. Seeing what everyone else is saying. Yeah, this idea of a gendered soul. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we have to acknowledge a concept of gender, right? But you know what gender is very difficult to kind of put your finger on. There's lots of kind of different ways of looking at it. But you know, one's gender is traditionally kind of stereotypically associated with certain forms of masculinity and femininity. But I think we need to keep making the point time and time again that sex is immutable and binary. I spoke at an event recently called the Battle of Ideas, which is run by Claire Fox and the Academy of Ideas. And it was on a panel about this and social contagion. And a young trans person stood up at the end, got very, very fiery, actually, was kind of shouting almost at myself in the panel, basically suggesting that we were complicit in the torture of children and the suicidality of young trans children. Really quite aggressive. And I responded truthfully with how I felt. And I said to that person, I have a lot of compassion for what you have gone through and what you continue to go through, but I do not recognize that you have changed sex, and I do not believe it is possible for you to ever change sex. And that's just how I see it. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to put forward positions like that. You know, because I do believe that these people deserve compassion. I mean, gender dysphoria, and particularly when we think about it in children, it can be so debilitating. I mean, the confusion that these young people and the disease they must feel in themselves and their bodies. I mean, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And they need as much support, compassion, and empathy that they can get. That doesn't mean that we need to all of a sudden ignore reality and forget how we really feel and throw our beliefs and views and principles to one side. You know, these things are not mutually exclusive. Yeah, I mean, the word cis is, I said this morning, I mean, I've never heard in my lifetime so many people using so much Latin in this country. It seems that Latin is making some sort of comeback, you know, because that's the etymology of the word cis. But yeah, and I've said publicly that I reject the term cis because it's based in ideology, and I find it painfully ironic that there's people out there, trans people, who are happy to throw abuse and call myself and others cis when we reject that term, but God forbid that we accidentally got their pronouns wrong. It's just complete and utter double standards. Someone's asked, do I believe that children who are trans have gender dysphoria? It's a difficult one because the current narrative is, well, not everyone who has gender dysphoria, sorry, not everyone who is trans has gender dysphoria. Okay. But the flip side of it is that everyone who wants to medically transition or legally transition has to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So I find these things to be incompatible with one another. If the only way to actually transition is to be diagnosed with a mental health condition, then it must equal that everyone who transitions has a mental health condition. So when people say do not pathologize being trans, I can't get on board with that. It just seems to be fundamentally inconsistent. But again, we've become so fixated and focused on gender dysphoria, and it ends up becoming the thing to treat, and that's why I think in many ways have gone down this medical pathway. It's okay, well, what can we do to relieve someone's dysphoria? And we're not looking at it holistically in the wider context. And, I spoke with Ritchie again in the interview, and he had a lot of other issues going on in his life by his own admission, including other mental health issues. And the clinicians just weren't that concerned with it. And as soon as they hear the word gender dysphoria, they latch onto that. And that's what they think about and what they care about, getting that solved. But is it just a symptom of wider issues going on in someone's mind? And my anecdote from Childline suggests that it is so, because when I kind of offered in this thought experiment to these young people, okay, you can have all the surgery and hormones you want in the world, are you happy? And time again, they would come back and say, no, I'm not. I'm still not happy because I still hate X, Y, Z about myself. That suggests that gender dysphoria is not the thing in and of itself that we need to deal with. It's just symptomatic of wider stuff. And we need to learn about these children. We need to be explorative. Again, explorative, open therapy without predetermined outcomes, exploring a child's upbringing and past. Basic therapeutic principles that we would apply to any other presentation or mental health condition. Probably go on for another 5-10 minutes, so we can probably get in a few more comments and questions. Let's see. Yeah, I agree with the individual who says to cis me is to missex me. At the end of the day, if you are not a signed up ideologue in this space, then people should not be referring to you in this way. It makes us sound like we're subsets of humans. It's cis male. It's very bizarre. It's very bizarre. And it suggests that there are other types of male. Obviously, there's different types of personalities within males, but there's only one type of male, and it's male, because that is a term and an idea that is born out of biology and science. Gender nonconformity, yeah. I completely agree, and I speak to people time and time again. I've got a good friend of mine who was very much gender non-conforming as a child. This is back in the 80s, and they say to me, thank God that I haven't been born 20, 30 years later, because I have no doubt that my parents would have sent me to a doctor and I would have ended up transitioning. And in reality, many people simply, as we know from the statistics, etc., just end up coming out as gay. But that's why when myself and Ritchie were talking about this idea of gay conversion, I mean, that's what this is in many instances. And we know that in certain contexts and cultures that it's preferable, unfortunately, in this day and age, to have a kid that is trans, and straight, rather than being gay. And we don't think about that at all. With all this noise about conversion therapy, we don't think about all the young gay children out there who are being effectively mutilated and converted into being straight. Someone's asked me about my case. Yeah, my case is it's ongoing. I mean, look, the legal system in this country is very slow. I had a judgment, a preliminary judgment, a few weeks ago, which was a mixed bag. Some good points, some bad. Myself and my legal team are still discussing what to do around appeals. But as things stand today, the kind of status quo is that It's going to go to trial against both my former place of study and the regulatory body for therapists, the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy. So I don't know when the trial date is going to be yet, but I always appreciate people's support and ongoing kindness and generosity to me, including helping me to fund the litigation in the first place. We've seen this time and time again, whether it was Maya Forstater's case or Alison Bailey's, of course, LGB Alliance's own ongoing case against mermaids, which is wrapping up today and tomorrow, or my case. Time and time again, it's been left to individuals and individuals' generosity and kindness to seek justice. And it's a shame that that's the case. But that's the system that we exist in the moment. And so I feel very fortunate to have been able to bring this litigation at all. Thank you. Someone's just posted the link to the crowdfunding page. All right, we've been speaking for just under an hour, so I think we'll probably wrap it up. I think what I would say to kind of finish up on is to not lose faith, because there have been a lot of changes, and I reeled them off at the end of my interview with Ritchie, and I reeled them off very quickly. But some of these things are pretty seismic. The Tavistock closing is huge. Mermaids being investigated by the Charity Commission is huge. These new NHS proposals around effectively banning the use of puberty blockers, except for studies, I said at the time, was seismic. I mean, these are changes in policy that we could only have dreamt about at one point not so long ago. And we've had, as we said, significant legal victories with Maya Forstater, Alison Bailey, and others. So I still believe the tide is turning. But this isn't over yet. As I said, God help us if a Labour government gets in. But even if not, we still have quite a fight on our hands, because society has become so overcome with this. And so all I can say to people, as far as possible, and you have to know your own personal circumstances, is to try and be brave about it. Because it's too important. I keep saying the stakes are too high. I keep saying we all have skin in this game. I mean, we're talking about children's well-being, women's rights, freedom of speech. This is huge. And I know it's scary, and I know there's a lot of abuse out there, and there's a lot of risks. But, for people who ask me, do I have regrets? Not one, not a single regret. And I would do the exact same thing all over again, because this issue is just far too important for us to stay quiet about. And to know as well that I believe there is a majority on your side, albeit at times a silent majority, but myself and others and the community within LGB Alliance and all the other organisations like Sex Matters that have popped up, we will support you. You are not alone in this. And for people who want to reach out to me on a personal level and talk about these things, or want me to support them in any way, I'm always happy to do so, because we have to be kind and generous to one another at the end of the day. We're all going through the same thing. We're all fighting the same cause. At the end of the day. But I'd like to thank all of you for taking part and for being very active in the chat. And I hope people have found it somewhat interesting. And again, I hope people have found the interview with Ritchie particularly interesting. That was the focus of this. So please share it as wide and far as possible. We need to get those in power, those responsible for media corporations and our politicians, to actually view this and hear what is happening to these young, vulnerable people in our society. It's the only way that we're going to get them to wake up and see what's been going on all this time. Thanks to each and every one of you for coming out tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and look forward to speaking to you again soon. Take care.